We are on Gunner land, recognising their sovereignty over this land, which includes their spiritual relationship to the land, which is indeed great and something we can learn from. We recognise their elders, past, present and emerging. We recognise this is a sacred place for the Aboriginal peoples of this land. Now, as you probably know, we have unfortunately not been able to have Philippa Rowland with us tonight. All sorts of strange circumstances have developed, which was relationship to her husband, among other things. And so we had at the last minute needed to find somebody who was able to fill in as usual in the last minute, just as he did 2 weeks ago, a man by the name of Jonathan Barker. Now Jonathan, I beg your pardon? 2 weeks ago. 2 weeks ago. 2 weeks ago he told us what the spirituality of the people were up in the Kimberleys. Absolutely fascinating stories, some of which I then reread, some of which are very similar to Aboriginal peoples, and a couple of them very similar to Genesis 1. Anyway, he's a man of God, a minister, not a pastor, a minister, not a bishop, but a man of God, and a man who has done great things for the PCNet, for us here and for this program, and I depend on him to be able to make sure I do the right thing and make sure this program operates. And so tonight we are welcoming on a topic of Buddhism for today, and Buddhism for today for the West is extremely valuable. I hope you enjoy his presentation. Welcome.
Thank you, Norm, for those kind words. A man of God, I think that the word God always for me is a question these days, so a man of good questions, perhaps. I'm not a Buddhist scholar or a practitioner of Buddhist practices, mostly. But I've been intrigued and been an admirer for years, many years. It's as if I've lived within the shadow of the Buddha since after we were in the Kimberleys, my wife and I lived in India. And I'm reminded of Gerd Thyssen's book, In the Shadow of the Galilean. Anybody remember it? Gerd Thyssen is an outstanding New Testament scholar, but he wrote what I read it as a novel, I couldn't put it down. And he brought his scholarship, and it was about this person who went to find Jesus of Nazareth. He was always trying to, I have to be there, I have to hear him, but he always turned up late. He would get there in a certain village, and Jesus was there yesterday. And so this went on and on and on right through to the crucifixion. You can see the very clever point that was being made. We're all in the shadow of Jesus. None of us met that Jesus of Nazareth. Anyway, in 1982, I was fortunate to be part of a pilgrimage. We took a group of young people from Whyalla to India in 1982. I don't know why you didn't come, but okay, it's never too. Anyway, we went to the Christian Retreat and Study Centre in Rajpur, which is up in the Himalayas north of Dehradun, a place called Rajpur, and our host, the Reverend P.D. Sham Rao, was into interfaith relations. Oh, come up to Missouri. You can meet my children, they're in school there, which was great because Janine and I looked after them when we were young. And he said, but we can go to the Dalai Lama's ashram, he's there. And so we went up to the Dalai Lama's ashram near Missouri, which was established where he first lived when he fled from Tibet and the Himalayan foothills. Guess what? He'd been there the day before. But his influence, his presence, his shadow now emanates far beyond Tibet, carried around the world, and the Buddhist tradition would touch us all. It's all as if we're all in the shadow of the Buddha. Now, what I'm going to share with you tonight comes primarily from Peter Abbs, A-B-B-S, his work called Buddhist Travels West, and it's in the July edition this year of Philosophy Now. But before I go any further, let me ask you, what images come to mind when you hear the word Buddhism? Call out when you have, if you would, and I'll call back because we're recording this. What images?
I don't know much about.
It's questions, something you don't know much about, okay?
Men in orange robes with begging bowls.
Men in orange robe with begging bowls?
Lighting candles.
Lighting candles? And I just had one that came to me that I'd forgotten when I visited that ashrams, flags, coloured flags.
Prayer wheels.
Prayer wheel? Okay.
Peace
Peace? The image of peace?
and not stepping on snails.
Now, I can see peace, I can't see a picture of that, but I can see a picture of not stepping on snails. Great. What feelings do you have towards Buddhism? Warm?
Yeah, I think we ended on a common path, but we're coming from different directions.
Okay, a sense of oneness or common path, okay. All right. Well, as I go through what I'm going to share with you, I'm going to ask if you will listen for things that touch you. Whether you might be able to share with us when we finish tonight any insights, things that touch you or insights for today's world. Your life, but also for today's world. Well, Buddhism in the West. In 1922, T.S. Eliot published The Waste Land, a great poem that ends with the mantra, Shanti, Shanti, Shanti. Shanti is a word from the sacred Hindu scriptures in the Upanishads. What does it mean? When Eliot himself was asked what it meant, he said, well, you know, it's equivalent to what St. Paul said. The peace that passeth understanding. But he chose not those words. You couldn't finish a poem with the peace that passeth understanding. He gave it Shanti, 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 because using those words from the East, he's offering something rather special. Yes, he is offering a peace of mind, but a peace of mind that somehow reverberates through one's existence. And Eliot said, it's much like a singing bowl. Shanti. 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 We've got a little one here that we use every Sunday, but also in 1922 there was another famous writer-author called Hermann Hesse. And he wrote, I guess it was in German, a novella called Siddhartha. And in that novel, the key word is not Shanti, but Om. O-M, sometimes spelled A-U-M, Om. That word, its sound, is sacred to Buddhists and Hindus. And when Siddhartha is on the verge of committing suicide, and so Siddhartha was one of the names of the Buddha, Siddhartha Gautama, the Buddha. When he's on the verge of committing suicide, this word rises up like a musical incantation, and its sound heals and saves his stricken life. And at the time of writing, Hess himself, stricken in his struggle to finish the novel, underwent therapy with guess who? Carl Jung. Another influence, and someone who was also impacted by Buddhism in his own way. So as Western psychology meets Eastern spirituality, a cultural transformation is beginning to take place, and the setting is the wasteland. The setting is the beginning of now. But there were even earlier influences. Well, who or what influenced Eliot and Hess? Eliot at Harvard studied Japanese religion and the Hindu scriptures, the Upanishads. Hess's source was the philosopher Schopenhauer, who'd also immersed himself in the Upanishads. Think of the Hindu Bible, you think of the Bible of the Hindu Buddhist traditions is the Upanishads. Now they've got other writings as well, but that's the status that they hold. And Schopenhauer announced that Sanskrit literature will become as influential as Greek literature was for the Renaissance. And on his desk he had two statues, one of Kant and Buddha, representing two forms of enlightenment. To quote him, he says, "The mystic is opposed to the philosopher by the fact that he begins from within, whereas the philosopher begins from without." Strangely, in the 19th century, another connection, of course, Schopenhauer comes into the picture. Schopenhauer was the main influence on the crazy Dane Fergus, our old friend, Søren Kierkegaard. And if you know Kierkegaard, there are some rather amazing synchronicities with Buddhist traditions. The emphasis on the relational self. A self is a self that relates itself to itself. And the whole notion of consciousness. But perhaps explains the Japanese reception of Kierkegaard. And I picked up this little bit of trivia. This wasn't in the article that I read, but you know that translations of Kierkegaard appear 30 years before English translations. Schopenhauer's works are remarkably close to Buddhism, and to quote, "In meditating one withdraws into oneself all the senses, forgetting the entire world, the self included. What's still left is one's consciousness. This is primordial being." And this term being, primordial being, is central to the current fascination with what's known as mindfulness. With a kind of clairvoyance, Schopenhauer saw that while the West would be preoccupied with objective knowledge and the control of external nature, the East would engage with inner wisdom and the power of being. Now, just a brief mention to something else, because it's important in the total scheme of things. Going back to 1879, Edwin Arnold wrote a narrative poem on the life of Buddha, which had a profound effect well into the 20th century. It was an instant bestseller. It was called The Light of Asia. And I used to wonder why, when we lived in India, we were based in what was Mumbai. You go down to the fort, the CBD area, and there's all these restaurants called The Light of Asia. And because I was intrigued that they all seemed to be run by different people but had the same name, I discovered they were mainly run by Neo-Buddhists. They'll get a mention again later. Anyway, it's this work that inspired a certain Madame Blavatsky, who established her powerhouse, Theosophical Society. Have you heard of it? The Theosophical Society. It was founded in 1875 with Buddhist ideals and had the noble aim of transforming consciousness. It was later taken over by another great luminary, a woman called Annie Besant, and it became worldwide. And they still have a shop here in Adelaide. I went searching for it and discovered it's no longer on King William Street, it's now on South Terrace. Note their emblem, the symbol of the serpent, which stands for wisdom, the interlaced triangles, which in shorthand are dark versus light, the Ankh in the centre looks a bit like a cross, and it is a symbol for resurrection. It comes from Egypt. The swastika, a symbol of the creator, creation and destruction. And the Om, the words at the top, the Logos. That's how they describe the Om. Now this movement led to a key turning point with a character known as Krishnamurti. He had been selected by Annie Besant to be her heir. And from childhood, he trained him with the expectation that he would be a Messiah-like figure to lead the world into an era of peace. And you can see that what's happening through the First World War and after the First World War, this movement was so strong, its emphasis on peace. People were tired of the old warfares. Anything for peace. But in 1929, at the Theosophical International Congress, among the 3,000 people present, Krishnamurti disowned the role given to him. He said, "You are depending for your spirituality on someone else, for your happiness on someone else, for your enlightenment on someone else. Inner peace can only come through self-knowledge, but obtaining that was an extremely difficult task." And that will resonate with the Dalai Lama's words, which you'll hear about shortly. So this speech that he gave is a model of mindfulness. It's existentially grounded, but the expectant Congress, it was a dynamite. It blew the whole movement apart. And it was as if the romantic pilgrimage to the East had come to a shocking halt. But the first glimmering of mindfulness is being born. It's interesting that the first person to actually coin the word mindfulness was a Welsh academic called Rhys Davies, and he did it in 1910. He rendered the word sati, which is Pali, that is the language of the early Buddhist scriptures, he rendered to mean the present moment. He said it's mindfulness. He had no idea that 100 years later it would become one of the mantras of the age. And it's an irony that while Buddhism wilted in places where it originally flourished, a diaspora took place and the religion crossed national boundaries and for the first time began to become an international force. Then in 1927, an obscure Japanese scholar, D.T. Suzuki, published in English essays on Zen Buddhism, drawing on the Mahayana tradition, not the original Theravada tradition. A Theravada tradition, think of Thailand, think of Burma, while hardly registering a quiver on the cultural Richter scale at first. It was this book that changed the cultural landscape more than any other. Essays on Zen Buddhism. And by the 1960s, Suzuki was considered to be the most renowned Buddhist writer of the age, and Zen was everywhere, ubiquitous. What was new? He moved away from the concepts of reincarnation and nirvana and affirmed the immediate here and now instant, the here and now instant of insight, like a flash of lightning, the moment captured in aphorisms and haikus. Suzuki's understanding of the Zen moment greatly influenced many great artists and scholars, in North America and Europe. Some, such as Eric Fromm, Karen Horney, and it inspired the beat poets and the counterculture movement of the 60s and 70s. Now, in 1997, I was studying in San Francisco, and some friends said, let's go up to Shadow Rock. I said, what's that? So, let's come and see. It's all mystery. I get there, and it's where people were practicing their Buddhist, I wouldn't call them beliefs, but expressing their Buddhism. Shadow Rock, north of San Anselmo. I couldn't believe it. I reckon there must have been 500 people there, and we all sat on the floor, cross-legged. In those days, that wasn't such a difficult thing as it is now. And it was silence for an hour. And then, guess what? We had one of the Beat Poets' addresses. We had Allen Ginsberg there, and he addressed us for another hour. But I remember something that he said, which I wrote down. Nobody knows whether we are catalysts or inventing something, or just the froth riding a wave of its own. We're all three, I suppose. It's interesting, I was studying at a seminary, of course, the San Francisco Theological Seminary in San Anselmo, part of the that complex at that other place, what's it called? Berkeley. Anyway, I thought, what are these Christians doing now? And the question, can you be a Christian and a Buddhist? Well, clearly there were. In fact, I even heard that there are Jewish Buddhists. Do you know what they're called? Boo Jews. We now come to the formidable Dalai Lama. The charismatic Dalai Lama also represents another branch of the Mahayana tradition, which has influenced the spread of mindfulness in the West. At the heart, he prizes compassion over all other values. His source is the concept of bodhisattva. That is where one refuses nirvana, that's ultimate enlightenment, and the escape from the isness of living and the endless return, and instead seeks to save all sentient life until each has achieved enlightenment, which of course mirrors the story of Gautama the Buddha, who's got to the point where he is about to enter nirvana. And for some reason he looks around and he sees the suffering of the world and he turns back. The Dalai Lama links mindfulness and compassion, but he says it's no easy matter. The Tibetan tradition doesn't flirt with the moment of sudden illumination. It requires continual practice and relentless application. The Dalai Lama has entered into a fascinating dialogue with the West too, in his espousal of the scientific method. Let me quote from an address given in Central Park in 1999. Quote, "If scientific analysis were conclusively to demonstrate certain claims in Buddhism are false, then we must accept the findings of science and abandon such claims." Wow. At the same time, he cogently argues that ethical concerns must be brought to bear on scientific investigation and that the two frameworks of the scientific and the spiritual must recognise and retain their intrinsic differences. Contemporary Buddhism has also entered the world of therapy. Under the influence of Vietnamese Buddhist monk Thich Nhat Hanh and Korean Zen master Sung San, the Massachusetts Medical School pioneered MBST. Can you guess what those words stand for? Well, I won't trick you. It's mindfulness-based stress therapy, MBST. which uses the many techniques of Buddhist meditation and mindfulness to alleviate and even cure depression and anxiety. And there's something else called cognitive behavioural therapy, that goes by the letters CBT, that also has been influenced by compassionate mindfulness. And I think this quote is apt. CBT, cognitive behavioural therapy, cultivates a freedom and the very act of focused attention. I am other than my reactions. I can look at them, and at best, I can let them go. Now we're going to have a little bit of a break and do something here. Focused attention. And almost universally, something is used when Buddhist practices and mindfulness practices are undertaken. I'm going to invite you to close your eyes. And it's breathing that leads us into a focused attention. So together with me, if this is comfortable for you, let's breathe in. Hold it for a moment. Then breathe out. Hold it. In again. Out again. One more time. In. And out. But keeping your eyes closed and breathing normally. Try savouring success. Recall a recent step that you've taken where you can say, I feel good about this. A recent step I've taken that I feel good about is, fill in the blank. I don't know about you, but I thought of something I hadn't thought of before. In that little exercise, we weren't doing focused attention to let go of things that might perhaps be negative. But we're also doing something to recall the things that we might be a little nervous about naming as positive in our lives. Now, Buddhism truly travels west. So if Buddhism is influencing the consciousness of the West, is the West influencing and maybe changing Buddhism? Well, yes, it is. Abbs, the author of the article that I'm basing most of what I'm saying on, maintains Buddhism has indeed become westernised. How so? Firstly, the Dalai Lama himself, in that address that he gave in Central Park that I referred to earlier, provides the term to describe this mutation. He claimed, I must emphasise, that we are the same. We have the same potential. Spiritual growth need not be based on religious faith. Let us speak of secular ethics. Just think about it. What's being proposed is utterly inclusive. We are the same, inclusive and non-hierarchical. And if we are the inheritors of ethical monotheism, what's being proposed is the ethics of reality. That is, the givenness of all that is, which includes the mystery, I might add, calls us out to care. Secondly, it seems that Buddhism is becoming less a religion and more an ethical orientation from this. It's an existential path where the aim is life flourishing right here and now. Indeed, the well-being of humanity in this present life. And it has had a diffuse and permeating effect. It's not necessarily, we Buddhists are going to teach you that, or we'll grab this from Buddhism and learn something. It's like something that's permeating our society. Not everyone knows where it comes from, especially in the counterculture movement and the New Age spin-offs. It plays an important part. Buddhism plays an important part in fostering considered reflection on experience, non-violent politics, and a compassionate relationship to all sentient life. But thirdly, there are significant changes inside Western Buddhism itself. It has imbibed essential ethical values from the West. What may these be? Notions of human rights and liberty. And especially, Buddhists have been in the forefront of affirming gender and sexual equality. Well, where to now? I'm beginning to summarise. How are we going? While we are privileged to live in a multi-faith world, though, I think we must be beware of romanticism, because just as Islam and Christianity can be co-opted to support and justify oppressive regimes, so can Buddhism. Take Myanmar, for example, and the ethnic cleansing of the Rohingya population. The Buddhist establishment is in favour of it. And yet, on the other side, there's that positive movement in India called the Neo-Buddhist Movement. It began, the other outstanding figure alongside Gandhi in the struggle for freedom in the subcontinent was Dr. Ambedkar. I knew his first name, but it escapes me at the moment. Anybody? Ambedkar. Gandhi came around, it took him time to be able to accept the Harijans, the people who were the Dalits, the people who were of no caste. Eventually he did. But right from the start, Ambedkar knew that in this freedom movement, the people who were of no caste would have to play an important part. And in a struggle for freedom, they could be left out. And it was through him that the great Neo-Buddhist movement has sprung up in India. And I know when we lived in Bombay, there were certain communities where the Neo-Buddhists had more or less taken over, created all kinds of social service systems because the official ones of the government were all fragile and falling apart. But now let's come to the summary. And I'm going to do it with what it's not. What Buddhism is not, there's not now an emphasis on doctrine or hierarchy, and it was there, but the emphasis on the exploration of the immediate moment and the place of being. It's not reincarnation or karma. Karma is like destiny, but presence and attention. Buddhism today is not a formal religion, and it never was at ease with that anyway. But it's more an existential way of life, a path rather than a religion. A path. Religionless Buddhism. We're hoping next year that one of the things we can have in our program is something called religionless Christianity, with Bonhoeffer, who came up with that idea. And fourthly, it's not sticking to set patterns and ideas of the past. However, the later scholars are intent of a re-articulation of Dharma that is truth, the inexorable truth of things and our best way to meet them. And they are redefining Buddhism in a postmodern context, and it's all to do with the search of meaning. And lastly, it's not, this is a kind of a double negative, I think, because it's not forgetting the past, not forgetting rather the source. Scholars refer back to the historical Buddha. Sound familiar? The historical Buddha, who always demoted deistic notions and religious dogmatism, who is about seeking understanding through a mindful examination, even though mindfulness was not the word in those days, and it always took place in the context of Sangha. Sangha is the word for community. So Buddhism does tend to work over against the individualistic overemphasis that's so characteristic of Western society. Well, I'm not quite finished, but I want to ask you, from what you heard tonight, what touched you? What new thought came to you? Or what is an insight that not just comes for you, but might be an insight for the world? And I'm going to invite you to talk to the people next to you. Don't let anybody be left out. If we have to have 3 persons in a group, please do. But can you wiggle your chairs around and just talk amongst what touched you, or what is an insight for today's world? What I'm asking is just the point here.
It shouldn't be relevant on the battery anyway, should it?
Oh,
It's gone all together now. The batteries.
friends, I'm not going to ask you to reflect back what you shared. Hopefully that in your conversations it was worthwhile the sharing that you had. We have a little glitch over there. The computer says the battery's running low, but we're supposedly got it hooked to the power, so why it's running low when it's hooked to the power. So there must be something wrong with the power connection, but we can't get to the workings. It's all behind. Anyway, which is a pity, because I was going to put some words up and I'm just going to have to read them for you. I had here I asked myself, how best to summarise what I've been sharing with tonight. And I came up with what I call a Buddhist lexicon for today. When I practiced this afternoon, Janine was checking me out. I said, the Buddhist lectionary. She said, no, that's not the right word, a lexicon. That is key words. The first one is well-being. The aim is the well-being of all things. And there's a Sanskrit word for each one of these. That's bodhicitta. And at the heart of well-being is shanti. The second is, I call it the tactic, is transcendence. Transcendence from suffering, dukkha. It's the original fourfold path of Buddhism. In the past, the word was enlightenment. That word still rings true, but I think because it's got kind of, for some people, fundamentalist type associations, it's laid aside a little bit. The focus is being, primordial being. The word is satori, awakened being, compared with an emphasis on doctrine. The locus, the place, is the present moment, samadhi. The practice is mindfulness, sati. The discipline is meditation, bhavana. But Eastern meditation is entirely different from Western meditation. This meditation always includes the physical yoga. The search is truth, dharma, and that is the search for meaning, as Stephen Batchelor has written in his recent book called After Buddhism. The task is nothing other than the path, and the path is the path within, Pali, again compared with religion, originally the Eightfold Path. The context is community, Sangha. And thanks to the Dalai Lama, the motivation is compassion, karuna. I want to conclude by quoting Peter Abbs's very last words in his article. We now need to place alongside science and technology the counterparts of wisdom and the courage to be. Or to express it more politically, we need to marry the political triad of liberty, equality and fraternity with the spiritual triad of being, reflecting and caring. For in our bewildered global age, the marriage of two forms of enlightenment is now possible, of the rational and the spiritual. This is an awakening which Schopenhauer envisaged 200 years ago. The two statues on his desk of Kant and the Buddha may strangely prefigure the union of our broken consciousness and our survival in the wasteland may well depend upon it. Over to you, Norm. Oh, no, you've got any questions?
Jonathan, could you just repeat that dichotomy with the marriage of...
Just use the mic. Thank you.
Could you just please repeat that dichotomy, the marriage of the two things, one with the other?
I'm going to read it again because I had the words up there and I was going to invite you to read parts of it with me. Well, we can't do that because I think it's just a great ending. I'll read it again, okay? We now need to place alongside science and technology the counterparts of wisdom and the courage to be. Or to express it more politically, we need to marry the political triad of liberty, equality and fraternity with the spiritual triad of being, reflecting and caring. For in our bewildered global age, the marriage of two forms of enlightenment is now possible, of the rational and the spiritual. And then just to add, this is an awakening which Schopenhauer envisaged 200 years ago. The two statues on his desk of Kant and the Buddha may strangely prefigure the union of our broken consciousness, and our survival may well depend on it. There you are, Donald Trump. Listen to that. All right. Okay.
Anyone else have a question? I'd like to just add one note. You talked about Ambedkar. I was in India about similar time. Ambedkar is a significant person. The program that we were running for Dalit, untouchable women and the like, sometimes we would have marches and protests through the street. But above all, they did not want to have at the head of the march Gandhi. They wanted Ambedkar. Ambedkar was the symbol of the people from the very bottom who had a major role, and he had a major role in actually forming the constitution of India. So you've got people like that. So that people we often ignore, but from where we were, Ambedkar was a hero who made the most of all of these faiths. Any other questions, comments? Yes, please.
What's in my mind is the long-term pervasive influence of Buddhism over the generations. It comes to mind, as I was telling Rita a moment ago, when I was working with some South Vietnamese Catholics. Sister Elizabeth said to me, "John, if you scratch a Vietnamese Catholic, you'll find a Buddhist underneath." And I've often wondered whether we underestimate the influence of Buddhism through the ages and at the present moment, perhaps on Chinese philosophy. Would you like to comment on that, or is anyone else able to add something to the way Buddhism today is affecting the politics that is so much in our minds at the moment?
Not affecting Trump.
That, if you scratch a Vietnamese Catholic, you find that underneath there's actually a Buddhist lurking behind all that. And I think that in our globalised culture today, you'll find that people that do move in more than one sphere in their lives, that everybody is given. I'm going back to the book Why Warriors Lie Down and Die, which is by the Arnhem Land writer about the Yolngu people. But he makes such a strong point that for Aboriginal people, their culture is taught almost from birth, and it's in language, and it wires the mind, the neurons are put in place, and along with it are the rituals, is the sense of place in your kinship system, and it's there forever. And you might come along and overlay on it a Christian story, and people might become Christians. But if you scratch those Christians, and they might even sing evangelical songs, you'll find that underneath there's a sensibility that was there from birth. So I think that that's there. Maureen's doing this. Layers. Okay. What I'm interested in is I foresee a certain kind of marrying between the Christian tradition and particularly Buddhism. I'm not sure where Islam is yet, because Buddhism, like Christianity, has entered into the postmodern age. It's done it more easily than any other religion, in my estimate. Christians, because they have been affected by the Enlightenment, have had to work out their story in the light of what the Enlightenment has blessed us with. And now we moved into the postmodern age. I think that suddenly we actually restore some things. I was very interested how the modern Buddhist scholars are going back to the source and looking again at Gautama, the Buddha. Buddha is like Christ. It's like a title. It's like a meaning thing you add to the historical person. His name was actually Siddhartha Gautama, and he became the Buddha. By the way, I couldn't get over the fact that when we checked on the Buddha statue that I will see tomorrow when I go down to Selleck's Beach, it's actually a goddess Buddha. It's a female Buddha. So whatever the Buddha symbol stands for, whatever enlightenment it is meant to represent, it obviously can show up in more than one way. Yeah. Tara, is it? Okay. All right, I'm not quite sure that answers your question, John, but I think that we live an exciting time of the mix of the two.
Is there an influence of Buddhism in China?
You scratch the communist, and I think you'll find that both Confucius and Buddha are there. But at the moment, the communist regime, the Berlin Wall never fell for them. They have kept their communist ideology. I mean, it's no longer Marxist-Leninism, it's now a nationalistic form. They've kept it in place. And the Buddhists are harassed as much as any of the other religious groups who are just tolerated. Oddly enough, Christians are tolerated more than Buddhists at the moment in China. You know what happens though when people are the ones who feel they're the most persecuted, what eventually happens. Anyway, that's enough.
Thank you very much. It was wonderful. Let's have a little word of thank you. But before we leave, two things. One is just a few hints of what might be here next year. Well, there are four major topics. We're exploring this, and you can change it if you wish. The mystery of worship. What's the mystery of worship? What happens? How do we include wonder in worship? The mystery of the ever-present Jesus. What's that all about? The mystery of creation, the spirituality of the first peoples, and so on. And the mystery of the elusive church, religion as Christianity, that we talked about before. Anyway, if somebody wants to have a look at what I've got here and would like to make some suggestions, we're happy to have them, and we prepare for next year. And before we do, and before you leave, it would be very nice if you would put a feedback on here and say, apart from, the wonderful work of Jonathan Barker, what other things would you like to mention on here? Things that you'd like to see for the future, suggestions, topics, etc. We'd like you to fill that in as well. Thank you very much for coming this year, and we'll see you all next year. Thank you very much.